I caught a little bit of a quiz show here a couple of weeks ago, and there was a question about the spirit of St. Louis. And I was surprised that there were any people who didn't know what the spirit of St. Louis is. Is there anybody here who doesn't know? Sarah, you're one of the younger ones here. You don't know what the spirit, good, thank you. Somebody tell Sarah what the spirit of St. Louis is. An airplane. And who was the pilot of that airplane? Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh. And the reason that he's famous, what? Now it comes to, okay. Lindbergh made the first solo flight across the Atlantic from New York to Paris in 1927, if I remember right. I've got the date written down in my text notes here a little bit later. But how many of you know why Lindbergh did what he did? Why did he fly across the Atlantic? The answer is not to get to the other side, okay? That was one answer that came out of the congregation at Valparaiso, so no, that's not the whole story. Yeah, he wanted to get to the other side. It's a little more than that. Go ahead, Ramon. What?
Did somebody make him an offer?
Ah, there was a prize that was publicized by this guy, Raymond Ortiz, who was a pretty wealthy guy. He owned a couple of big fancy schmancy hotels, and he put up a prize of $25,000 to anybody who could fly across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. So now you know about the Ortiz Prize, but how many of you, if you've heard of Lindbergh, how many of you know who some of Lindbergh's competitors were in trying to be the first to make that flight? Anybody know any of those? Well, now you're going to have a chance to hear about a couple of these. The first was a man named René Fonck, who was a World War I French ace. He was credited with about 75 kills, the most of any pilot in World War I. Fonck was determined that he was going to win that prize. He had a marvelous plane, a big tri-motor job. There's a picture of Fonck's plane. Fonck, however, wanted not only to travel in luxury across the Atlantic, he wanted to arrive in style. He had a crew of 3 in this luxurious plane. There were heavy chairs, mahogany tables, a sofa that could be converted into a bed. There was a cooking area with a small kitchen, and not just bottles, but cases of wine and champagne. And before takeoff, he had a local hotel deliver a hot dinner that included clam chowder, terrapin, roast duck, and turkey, kept warm inside a heavily insulated cabinet. The plane was built to carry a load of 20,000 pounds. A lot of power in those 3 engines. However, fully loaded, Fonck's plane weighed 28,000 pounds, right? Any of you who know anything about avionics can do that math. Even if you don't know a whole lot about avionics, if something is built to lift 20,000 pounds and you load it down with 28,000 pounds, what's going to happen? Well, yeah, there we go. Jackie's doing one of these. And Fonck's plane made it to the end of the ride of the runway and over a little rise, and then it took a nosedive, burst into flames. Fonck and his navigator made it out alive, but the other 2 crew members never did. Well, there was another person that seemed to have probably the best chance of winning that Orteig Prize, the millionaire Charles Levine, the guy on the right. Levine hired a couple of really good pilots. The guy on beside Levine there, his name is Chamberlain, and there was another pilot named Bertrand that Levine also hired, and Levine was all about money, and so he was going to get a bunch of publicity, and so he was going to wait until the morning that they were going to take off to name who was going to be the pilot. He had a great plane called the Columbia. In fact, it had made a non-stop flight farther than the distance from New York to Paris already. He'd already done it once, okay? And, but these two pilots could not get along. They had competing ideas of the way things should be done, from equipment to the flight plan, and to make it worse, to cause even more strife and frustration among the people involved. Levine, the night before they were supposed to take off, brought a contract to the two pilots. And the contract stipulated that they would receive no money or no profit from the publicity of winning this prize. It would all go to Levine. Well, these pilots were ticked off. Bertrand went and got an injunction against the flight. The flight was grounded and ended up never taking off because it was all embroiled in court. Well, Lindbergh, on the other hand, was personally involved in nearly every aspect of building his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. There is Lucky Lindy and his plane. He kept everything in that plane to a minimum. It had one engine to conserve fuel. It had one pilot with one seat. That plane was so stripped down, it didn't even have a windshield. He just had a little periscope up front to see out of the front. If he wanted to see out, he had to stick his head out of the side window, which was the only window in that whole airplane. How many of you have actually seen the Spirit of St. Louis at the Air and Space Museum in D.C.? A few of you have, okay. It's tiny. This is like a little Piper Cub. And the first time I looked at it, my jaw dropped because I said, my gosh, there's nothing to that plane. It was mainly a flying gas tank. Lindbergh was so concerned about saving weight and stripping this thing down that he even cut the paper off of the edges of his navigational charts to save weight. That's how focused he was on reaching that goal of being the first one to get across the Atlantic safely and alive. Well, Lindbergh landed near Paris on May 21st, 1927, 33 and a half hours after he took off from New York. He was greeted by cheering crowds. This is an actual photo of some of the crowds gathered near Paris when Lindbergh landed. I think old pictures like this are really cool. Now, you know that the press dubbed him Lucky Lindy, but in those days, flying from New York to Paris didn't just happen by luck. It took careful planning. It took a lot of discipline. It took somebody being willing to suffer some hardship, some discomfort, to be able to meet that goal. Now, what I want you to hear is, just like in this Orteig Prize, being generous is one of those things that doesn't just happen by luck. I don't know how many times I've had people tell me Pastor, when I win the lottery, I'm going to tithe to the church. I've never known anybody to give lottery prize winnings to a church that I've served. So it doesn't happen by luck. The problem is that in America, we are a lot like those competitors for the Ortiz Prize. Some of us are like Funk, and we are so burdened down with possessions and with concern about our finances that we just end up crashing and burning. And we never really get off the ground with being generous. Others of us are kind of like the situation with Levine and the people on his team. There's competing goals. People are pulling in different directions, pursuing different ends that they want, never really get on the same page. And so when that happens, you just don't make it to your goal if you can't pull together. And plus the fact a lot of people have problems communicating about money in their families. It hasn't been very long ago I was talking to a young pastor, and he said, you know, I would really like to be able to tithe, but I have never been able to tithe, to give 10% of my income to the church. And so I started asking him questions, and first of all, he and his wife never really talked about money. They just, you know, kind of, she'd spend what she wanted and he'd spend what he wanted, and so they never really sat down and talked and planned. And so I also said, well, how do you handle your giving? Do you when you get your paycheck, do you sit down and write out your tithe check or what you want to give to the church? He said, no, we usually just wait and give what's left over at the end of the month. And I said, well, if you do that, you are never going to be able to tithe, because all of us know that if we just try to give from what's left over at the end of the month, usually there's nothing left at the end of the month, right? You've got to make plans for it. You've got to have a goal. You've got to have plans for how you're going to be able to divide up your resources. If you want your life journey to be generous, or really if you want to reach any other goal, you need to be as careful and intentional as Lindbergh was. Whether it's generosity or reaching some other goal, it almost never happens by accident. Generous people have to think about what they want to accomplish, plan a strategy, and then have the courage and discipline to act on that. Now, Tom Berlin, the guy that wrote the book Defying Gravity, said that he talked to a lot of extremely generous people over his years as a pastor and over all the speaking that he does about finances. And he said that he has found that generous people basically have three secrets, or three things that they really do to help them reach their goals of giving. The first one is to make a budget. Now, I think that there are still some sheets back there on the table about with a budget from Dave Ramsey, some of the ones from Berlin that help you plan a budget. Budgeting is important because if faith is a priority in our lives, we have to begin first with that part of our income that we're going to invest in God's work. If we don't plan this first, we're going to be like my pastor friend who just ends up giving leftovers that often aren't there. Using a budget helps us look at allocating all of our money. It helps us to spend in each area of our lives, in our needs, care for our families and everything, in a way that's pleasing to God in every area. so we can balance our resources. And so if we do that, if we're serious about being stewards and spending according to God's priorities, we can do that, but we've got to budget our money. The second secret of generous givers, according to Berlin, is that they live simply. Don't live in usually big expensive houses, don't always drive a new car. They do live simply. Thomas Stanley and William Danko wrote a book entitled The Millionaire Next Door, and they observed that wealthy people often live in average homes, drive used cars, and don't wear the most expensive clothes. And that's because they understand the difference between needs and wants. They, a lot of times, will gain their wealth through very careful attention to what comes in and what goes out of their business, and they apply that same diligence to their home finances, and that the disciplines of working a budget and being frugal really push them toward simplicity. Simplicity, Berlin said, is the single most effective thing that can help people be generous. Now, some of you remember John Wesley's saying. He said, earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. When he said save all you can, he wasn't talking about putting your money into a bank account. He meant save by being frugal, by being thrifty, by not spending excessively. And when you do that, you are able to be generous with the money that God lets you have. Now, we've all heard about people that Tom Berlin would call gravity-bound folks who see simplicity as a lack or absence of good stuff, right? They assume that simplicity means that your bed is hard, your car is undependable, your clothes are unfashionable and uncomfortable, you eat lousy food like beans and hardtack or something, and that's what you live on. No, simplicity isn't about that. People that are pulled down by financial gravity assume that the good life comes from good and expensive stuff. But as in that song that we heard again this morning, joy doesn't come from the things that we own, but in the things that we leave behind, really for God's sake, and for being able to do something important with what we leave behind. That simplicity isn't about denying yourself, but about getting rid of things that stand between you and your goals. And if your goal is being generous and giving to God's work, anything that interferes with that is just something to be removed from life. The last secret of generous people that Berlin said is that all of them set goals for generosity. They set goals for the good that they hope to do with their time and money. You know, it's just like planning your day. If you just say, well, I might go to work a while if I got enough time left at the end of the day. That doesn't really cut it for most bosses, right? Unless you're your own boss, and right, Tim, but since you're your own boss, that might work a little bit more effectively then, but we've got to figure out and allocate, whether it's time, whether it's money, whatever. We've got to do it considering God's calling in our lives, considering what gives God joy and what gives us joy. People aren't generous because it feels icky to give. People are generous because it feels great to give. It feels good to be able to help others. And when people identify those things, they can set goals toward being generous. When we are generous for God's sake, it's our mission. It's not like we're doing something for God by being generous. We're being a part of what God is doing in the world. It's like joining God's team. And it's amazing what we can do at any level if we set goals for generosity and live to meet those goals. Of course, if we aren't careful, we'll end up settling for a life that is pulled down by the weight of money and possessions. We miss out on what Jesus said is the abundant life because we're so weighed down with stuff. Now, in our hearts, none of us want an ordinary life, right? We want an extraordinary life, something that's going to produce good in the world. Chilton told me a story the other day. Chilton, I hope I'm not stepping on your toes by telling this, that he said, you know, we don't have much of a lawn. And he was talking with one of his neighbors about that, and he said, well, you're raising a lawn, I'm raising boys. So you're focused on what's most important. That's the goal. The grass will come later when those boys are gone and have families of their own. But for right now, it's important to let them get out there and run around and do good things and be healthy. So, you know, it's the same way with whatever we choose to do. We can defy the pull of things and money if we are just willing to be committed to what's most important in our lives. Now, this past week, most of you got in the mail, if you haven't, it's coming, got an estimate of giving card along with this little table that shows what your weekly gift would be as a percentage of what your annual or weekly income is. And now, those estimate of giving cards, that is not a pledge. It's not a promise. These things are tools to help you set a goal for what you want to give and then try to keep on track doing it. So next week, I'm going to invite people to come and to bring their estimate of giving cards. We're going to pray over them. I'm going to collect them, and then next September, we're going to mail those back to you. You know, not to try to guilt you into giving to the church, but to say, okay, here's what you set as a goal, and it'll be your way of checking on whether you're keeping up with those goals or not. This is for your benefit, not for my benefit or the church's benefit. And if you don't want to set a goal, turn in a blank card. I mean, that's fine. That really is up to you. The reason I'm doing this is because I know for sure that since I've been here, that's been 6 years, that the churches have not done any kind of pledging or financial campaign. And I don't know, I know you probably didn't do one under the previous 2 years of pastors. During the time that Chuck was here, did you do any other kind of financial campaign other than the gold bricks for mission shares? Ramona's saying no. Anybody remember anything? So it's been a lot of years since you folks have been used to pledging, setting those goals, and that's why it's important. Again, this is not to try to be oppressive in any way, but to help each of you set goals, because that is going to be important for the life of this church as we go forward into the future. Okay, well, I'm going to invite you as you look at those estimate of giving cards, as you think about those, pray about them. I'm going to invite you to partner with God to provide things like the worship and pastoral care that we provide in the church, to do things like feed the hungry, give clean water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to help with medical needs of those who are ill, and that kind of stuff that you do through mission shares every year. And until then, I want you to remember and consider those three secrets of generous people. So make a budget, live simply, and set your financial or giving goals. And thanks be to God that God has given us the opportunity to deal with the things that God has given us in a way that pleases Him. Right, Eddie?